So before we start, I want to thank Sue for inviting me to present at the Seattle Lodge. Sue was kind enough to listen to a rough version of this talk, and her encouragement helped me to move away from a more academic presentation and one that speaks more to the heart. Before we start, I did want to say a few things about my approach to this topic. One aspect that drew me to Theosophy was its strong encouragement of each individual member to pursue his or her own spiritual studies in whatever direction one is drawn toward, and to share what we learn with our fellow members. We all have something to contribute to the greater knowledge of the group. As a trained academic, my approach to theosophical studies has always been to read primary sources and documents whenever possible. And I will explain this a bit more as we go through the slides. You often stumble upon real gems that others miss. Secondly, I love to work with photographs whenever possible, not as adornments to words, but as wisdom bearers on their own. Lastly, I ask you to please hold your questions until the end or write them in the chat so you don't forget, and I can answer them when I finish the presentation. Uh-oh. Sorry, the thing I was going to use this slide didn't work. Okay, so my first slide is actually the three objects of Theosophy. I wanted to begin with the three objects which all Theosophists pledge to uphold upon becoming a member of the society. The first object, to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. Right there in the first line is the concept of universal brotherhood, which is just another name for the beloved community that King often references and later Thich Nhat Hanh. Second object, to encourage the comparative study of religion, philosophy, and science. As we will see, both men also uphold the second object, specifically in the comparative study of religion. The third object, to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in humanity. For the third object, I have some ideas of what these men might say were the, quote, powers latent in humanity, but I don't want to get off track before we even start. If others are interested, we can save that for the question period later. So what drew these men together? What created this bond of friendship and shared identity? We are first struck by the superficial differences between King and Han. One Black, one Asian, one American, one Vietnamese, one Christian, one Buddhist. But as I researched and in my personal meditations, I realized beyond these differences lied a wealth of shared experiences. As we will see, the bond created between these two men was strong and influential, despite the few moments that they actually spent together physically. Each man radically restructured his personal and political philosophy as a result of their friendship, often at great risk personally, alienating long-term allies and friends. So I created this slide. On the right, I love photographs. On the right is Thich Nhat Hanh at 16 years old when he takes his Buddhist vows and begins to study under his own teacher and master. And then King, he looks so old there, but he's only 19 years old, you know, but he's always looked a little older than he was. So when I really kind of thought about these two men, I started to focus on, well, what they seem to be so bonded so quickly. So I looked at some of the similarities in their biographies. And First came is both men came from loving and stable homes. These were men that grew up very close to their parents, and does not seem to be much disruption in their home lives. Both were highly educated and began formal education and chosen vocations as teenagers. Many people don't realize that King enters college at the age of 15 years old. So by the time he's 19, he's in the seminary, and it really sort of fast tracks him age-wise. He's only 25 when the Montgomery bus boycott happens. Both had knowledge of religious traditions other than their own, which goes back to the second object, and both were advocates of learning more about other religious traditions. And I'll go into that more later for King especially. Both men were prolific writers. They both identified as writers. I didn't get how many books Thich Nhat Hanh has written, but we all know it's at least 30 plus. He was also a poet. And then King wrote a lot of speeches, but he also wrote several books as well. So they really identified both as writers. Both were, quote, world citizens and saw themselves aligned with all people who suffered. They did not believe in national boundaries. In addition to religious leadership, both created and led social service organizations, especially in their early period. And then lastly, both were deeply involved in the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is often called FOR, a pacifist organization founded by a British theosophist in 1917 after World War I. So this really, thinking about this really made me realize that they were coming from very similar perspectives before they even met. So interbeing, to be is to interbe. You cannot just be by yourself alone. You have to interbe with every other thing. And this is the core teaching of Thich Nhat Hanh. At the heart of both men's social, political, and religious philosophy is the notion of interbeing, which comes from the Prajna Paramita Heart Sutra. Prajna is wisdom and paramita is perfection. So it means the perfect wisdom of the Heart Sutra, which is one of the most, if not the most, revered sutra in Buddhism. Recitation of the sutra, Han claimed, resulted in the liberation of all suffering. As for the photos on this slide, Han writes in his commentaries on this sutra, roses and garbage inter are. Without a rose, we cannot have garbage. And without garbage, we cannot have a rose. They need each other very much. The rose and the garbage are equal. In my experience, this can be a meditation if you would like. When you look at a rose, try to see the compost. When you see the compost, try to imagine the rose. So here's a King quote on interrelatedness. And this is really King's term for interbeing. These are really interchangeable in a lot of ways. And King writes, and I believe this is from a letter from a Birmingham jail. He writes, whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. And he goes on in several of his speeches to talk about this idea of the interrelated structure of reality. And if you don't catch that core concept within King's work, you really miss a lot of what he's trying to say. King's term for the same idea of interbeing was interrelatedness, which he often referenced in his writings and speeches. And it spoke to the heart of his philosophy of nonviolent protests. But this concept is much more Hindu and Buddhist than Christian, which I always found puzzling. Where was he pulling this idea from? Since we are at a Theosophical Society meeting, I wanted to share a quote from Helena Blavatsky, emphasizing the same idea of interbeing and interrelatedness that Han and King discuss so frequently. From Key to Theosophy, all men have spiritually and physically the same origin, which is the fundamental teaching of Theosophy. As mankind is essentially of one and the same essence, and that essence is one, infinite, uncreate, and eternal, whether we call it God or nature, nothing, therefore, can affect one nation or man without affecting all other nations and all other men. Different words, but the same idea. And next, the beautiful prayer by Annie Besant, recited often at theosophical meetings. O hidden life, vibrant in every atom. O hidden light, shining in every creature. O hidden love, embracing all in oneness. May all who feel themselves as one with thee know they are therefore one with every other. Again, different words, but the same idea. So this is the photograph that got me on the path to wanting to learn more about King and Han's relationship. I discovered this photo actually at a meditation retreat in 2000 with Thich Nhat Hanh at UCSD. And at the time, I was a graduate student in sociology, and I was studying the civil rights movement. And I had never heard of Han. I never had known there was any connection to King. And so that puzzled me and intrigued me. So really since then, I've been trying to fit together all the puzzle pieces of this friendship to my own satisfaction. And today you get sort of the culmination of a lot of that effort. So in this quote, it says, this is from Han, the moment I met Martin Luther King Jr., I knew I was in the presence of a holy person. In Vietnam, we refer to Dr. King as a bodhisattva, an enlightened being devoted to serving humanity. So that's a pretty heavy quote from Han. And again, I sort of wondered, was there more to this story than just the face value of this photo? Let's see. Han was in awe of what King had accomplished in a few short years, which were in stark opposition to the escalation of conflict in Han's own country of Vietnam. Nothing that Han had done from 1963 to 1966, when he met King, had de-escalated the conflict there. In fact, it was the opposite. So Han was very much, adoring King in a sense of how were you able to do this? How were you able to move the people such that you could accomplish what you accomplished in the civil rights movement when myself and all my efforts in Vietnam are going in the opposite direction? He was very intensely desiring of what this wisdom that King could give to him. Now, here is where things get interesting. And one reason I am such a proponent of reading primary sources. In reading a biography of King in 2016, which is about 16 years after I saw the photograph, I stumbled upon a throwaway line by about King's studies at Krotona Seminary, where he took a class in Mahayana Buddhism. Thanks to the internet, I was able to pull the actual seminar papers that he wrote at Krotona during that period, a virtual goldmine. And then I put, and possibly another talk altogether, because there's so much there. During those years, King took classes related to Hinduism, Buddhism, and ancient mythology. He wrote a paper, for example, on Sumerian myths and Babylonian myths and how they related to the Old Testament. I saw clearly that his notion of interrelatedness was seeded in these courses. So I had kind of fit one piece of the puzzle. I could see that this notion of interrelatedness came directly out of his own studies of Mahayana Buddhism. So when Han publicly refers to King as a bodhisattva in 1966, King would have known exactly what he meant, since he himself wrote a whole paper on this topic. So actually, let me go back a slide. So this is in his paper from 1950, and this is King's words. He writes, "It is the Buddha nature within us that unites itself with our wills in the struggle for salvation. Without this more than human aid, salvation from ignorance and desire would be impossible." So King is at about 21 when he wrote this, and he's at Crozer Seminary. And then later in that paper, he talks about the ethics of Mahayana Buddhism, and he writes, "The ethical ideal of the Mahayana is the bodhisattva, a future Buddha." And then he goes on to describe the 10 stages in progress of the bodhisattva includes, and I just included one, the 6th stage, the seeker turns to the basic principles of dependent origination and non-substantiality, which is the Heart Sutra, by the way, and effect his aim towards universal salvation. And in that paper, he relies heavily on Raja Krishnan's Indian philosophy book. I can't go into it here, maybe in the questions, but what I realized when I read this paper was many of these stages actually parallel his own development of his nonviolent stages of his own process. So I began to realize, wait a second, a lot of what he later turns into nonviolent protest actually kind of comes out of these stages, but it was probably too much for this talk, but I just wanted to say there's more to go into depth in that as well. When I think of King at 21 years old, writing this paper, not knowing his own personal destiny, that in less than 5 years, he would lead the Montgomery bus boycott. And even more strangely, he would be named a bodhisattva himself by a renowned Zen Buddhist teacher and friend. Real life is truly stranger than fiction. More well known is King's reverence, not just knowledge of Gandhi and his philosophy of satyagraha, which means in Sanskrit, holding on to the truth. So I wanted to include this photograph. This is a photograph at King's home in Montgomery. And what's really interesting to me about this photograph is we look at where Gandhi's positioned in the home. And this would normally be in a Christian household. This would be where the cross would be or a picture of Jesus. But in King's home, he has a picture of Gandhi. And this really, in a photograph, really shows you how much he revered Gandhi and how much he was his guiding light, at least in the early stages of his, nonviolent civil rights movement. So he wrote this. It's called it's a piece, again, go back to the primary sources. He wrote an article for Ebony magazine, My Trip to the Land of Gandhi. And that was in 1955. He was there for a month, which is a long time. It was his longest out of state visit. He went to India for the longest period of time. It was a trip he originally was going to take in 1956, but because of various reasons, it was delayed until 1959. So several theosophists, I did a little bit of research as best I could. because several theosophists assisted with the trip or actually met personally with King, including Wadia and Ramachandran, as well as Nehru and the Fellowship of Reconciliation groups in India. In fact, one of the talks was held at a ULT lodge in India. He also met Gandhi's family and visited his home. And he was inspired by the land reform movement and the work of Vinoba Bhave, which I'll show you in a second, a photo of him. Let me see. So in the beginning, he opens this article with a quote I really like, and he says, "For a long time, I had wanted to take a trip to India. Even as a child, the entire Orient held a strange fascination for me. The elephants, the tigers, the temples, the snake charmers, and all the other storybook characters." I included this quote partly because many theosophists believe in past lives. And I believe here is some evidence that his connection to Gandhi in India comes deeply from within his soul, before he was even at the seminary and learning about Hinduism and India. I like this photo of King in India because it's one of the rare informal shots of him where he truly looks happy and comfortable. The rapport between him and his Indian compatriots, in this case Bhave, is strong on this trip. In many ways, Gandhi, and perhaps Bhave too, was to King as King was to Thich Nhat Hanh. King admired what Gandhi had accomplished in India under British colonial rule, just as Hanh admired King's accomplishments in the civil rights movement in America. So basically, we have this legacy between Gandhi, King, and then Thich Nhat Hanh. He writes in this article, "The trip had a great impact upon me personally. I left India more convinced than ever before that nonviolent resistance is the most potent weapon available to see the amazing results of a nonviolent campaign." And there you see King as well with his wife, Coretta. The energy of this trip to India ushers King into the next stage of his political life, culminating in the March on Washington and his Nobel Peace Prize in 1963. The influence of both Buddhism and Hinduism on the formation of his political philosophy during this period, though, is missing from almost all popular and academic accounts of King's life. So we're now in 1966. This is a photograph of the first meeting between Thich Nhat Hanh and Martin Luther King Jr. at a conference organized by, again, the Fellowship of Reconciliation in Chicago. And in there, they'd issue a joint statement. And one line, the joint statement reads, "The enemies of those struggling for freedom and democracy are not man. They are discrimination, dictatorship, greed, hatred, and violence, which lie in the hearts of man. These are the real enemies of man, not man himself." Thich Nhat Hanh wrote to King in June 1965. Now, this is partly because King, after winning the Nobel Peace Prize, Hanh felt that King should be more vocal about the war in Vietnam. So he felt if he could get King to speak out against the war in Vietnam, that would make a difference in reducing the level of conflict there. So he was pushing really hard to get King on board to make a statement against Vietnam War. So he writes to him in 1965. A year later, a meeting was arranged through mutual contacts at the Fellowship of Reconciliation. As a result of the participation in this news conference, Thich Nhat Hanh was exiled by both North and South Vietnam for over 40 years. So that conference was pivotal for Han. After that conference, he really never could set foot in his home country, which bothered him greatly. He did not actually return until, I believe, he returned in mid 2000s, but not permanently. He made it his home in 18. While behind the scenes, King supported the end of Vietnam War, it took almost a year after this news conference before he really publicly, quote, came out against the war in his famous Beyond Vietnam speech. And this was written in April 4th, 1967. And one line, it's a really good speech. If you are interested, I really encourage people to read the actual speech. But he writes, "We must rapidly shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered." It's a very powerful speech by King. It does not he does not make friends from writing Beyond Vietnam. And I have a little bit more to say about that in a second. Here's also a nice photograph of King actually at a Vietnam War protest, which you don't see too much. And this is in 1967. So by the 1967, after this speech, he's on board and he is moving really against the will of a lot of his allies in the Christian community and also in the civil rights community. He's pivoting towards anti-war global peace movement as his primary focus. Oops, I think I'm one ahead. Oops, sorry. The Beyond Vietnam speech was not well received by allies in the civil rights movement or by those in the Johnson administration, who he was actually pretty close with. It was a political low point in his career, yet King felt a strong personal moral calling to take this stance. In researching this period, I also discovered that Han had a long private conversation with Defense Secretary Robert McNamara shortly before he resigned in 1968 about the devastation the war had brought to the Vietnamese and to American soldiers. I'm gonna make sure. During this, quote, low period for King, there is evidence that Han continued to correspond and to keep in touch with his friend. In this telegram, Han talks about issues renewing his visa or problems with renewing his visa and the hopes of visiting King the week of February 24th, 1968. By April, a mere few weeks later, King was dead, assassinated on the 1-year anniversary of his Beyond Vietnam speech in Memphis, Tennessee. This event was personally devastating and extremely discouraging for Thich Nhat Hanh. So here's a quote from Han that was in 2014. He said, "I was in New York when I heard the news of the assassination. I was devastated. I could not eat, I could not sleep. I made a deep vow to continue building what he, meaning King, called the beloved community, not only for myself, but for him also. I have done what I promised to Martin Luther King Jr., and I think that I have always felt his support." This is a very strong statement. And, you know, it's very surprising that So little people really know about this friendship and how deep it was, especially for Han. We don't know for King because King was not able to develop his career in the same way that Thich Nhat Hanh was. So then the question here remains, how did Thich Nhat Hanh keep his promise to King to uphold the beloved community? Oops. Making sure. So what is King's beloved community? And this could be a talk also of itself, so I shortened it here. But the beloved community is not the absence of tension, conflict, or confrontation, which King called a negative peace. To strive, but rather to strive towards a just reconciliation demands a commitment to staying in dialogue with people across differences, in the inevitability of disagreements, misunderstandings, and conflict. So this is very important to both Thich Nhat Hanh's work, if you're familiar with it, but also with King, that this idea, I think I have it on the next slide, is not to get trapped, what they call the 3 traps of negative peace, which is either to fight somebody in the hopes of winning them over to your perspective, or to overly accommodate somebody in the hopes that that creates some type of peaceful relationship that maybe is floundering, or to avoid the whole thing entirely, to just not talk about it. When they talk about those inevitable disagreements and conflicts, there's a tendency to get trapped in all 3 of these. And that's what King is referring to as a negative peace. And this again is in his letter from a Birmingham jail speech. And so I think this is interesting and also challenging as well for all of us. So overcoming a negative peace is at the core of living in a beloved community. King, in the letter from a Birmingham jail, King outlines the unproductive traps towards creating peaceful and lasting resolution to conflict. These can occur just as easily between nations and family members and everyone in between. Later, when we do an exercise, we will examine how these traps can cause negative peace in our own lives. So here's another quote by Catherine Tingley, a theosophist. It is always easier to fight imaginary battles with a foe at a distance, but we are apt to fail in the little battles with the foes at our own door. And I read this quote because I think it pertains more to actually to Thich Nhat Hanh than King. While in King's public writings, he mainly addressed conflict resolution in societal, national, and global realms, I believe that King's legacy for Thich Nhat Hanh was to teach us how to achieve peace, true peace in our own personal lives. As Tingley says, it is often more difficult to create peace in our personal lives. Han's life work, I realize from the result of this research, has been to teach us how to live in a beloved community with each other by practicing mindfulness in our daily lives. And so here, in a sense, make it to another page. In a sense, you build up. I had these slides reversed, but in a sense, you can try to go for global peace, societal peace, institutional peace in the hopes of creating personal peace. But I think what Han came to realize was actually, if we really set this goal for a global beloved community, we have to start with ourselves. We really have to start with ourselves. Han continually emphasizes the role of cultivating compassion for others, and one of the best ways is to practice deep listening, which heal all types of social and personal relationships. And now this is another quote from Han. In Buddhism, we speak of the practice of deep listening, compassionate listening, a wonderful method by which we can restore communication. Communication between partners, communication between father and son, communication between mother and daughter, and communication between nations. This was actually comes from a speech, again, a primary source, that was from September 25th, 2001. Thich Nhat Hanh spoke at the Riverside Church in New York about the recent 9/11 event. What's very interesting, again, is the Riverside Church is no coincidence. He is giving his speech 3 weeks after 9/11, and he's encouraging really the United States to listen to our enemies, find out, why do you hate us so much? We want to know, what are your reasons? We're here to listen to you. We're here to help heal. And he delivers this very controversial speech that was not well received at the Riverside Church in New York. And why? Well, that is where King, if you remember, delivered his Beyond Vietnam speech. So I do not think it's a coincidence that he delivers his sort of Beyond 9/11 speech at the exact same location that King chose to do Beyond Vietnam. Let me see, let me make sure I don't lose track. So, like King, Han's speech was not well received and angered many people. I know that this was a challenging time for Thich Nhat Hanh because he spoke about the seed of anger that resurfaced with him from the American intervention in Vietnam at a retreat I attended with Han in 2002. A year after 9/11, Han publishes his book, Anger, The Wisdom for Cooling the Flames. What I always loved about Thich Nhat Hanh was that he processed his own emotions, like the rose and the garbage, through his own writings. He never claimed to be, quote, above it all. In 1975, Han completely stops all political activism related to Vietnam and settles in France, which became his permanent home during exile. In 1981, he established Plum Village Retreat Center and later several more retreat centers in the United States, in California, New York, and also Mississippi. In this way, Han is similar to the Theosophists who established places like Krotona and Pumpkin Grove for their followers. I love this photo because Han, who's obviously in the center there, and Sister Chan on the far right and Sister Annabelle on the far left, they just look so young and so vibrant there. Just so nice to see this photograph. When Han died in January, he did not name a successor. He believed that his successor would be the beloved community and not a single person. And he wrote this: "It is possible that the next Buddha will not take the form of an individual. The next Buddha may take the form of a community practicing understanding and loving kindness, a community practicing mindful living. And the practice can be carried out as a group, as a city, or as a nation." If I have not convinced you of the importance of King to Thich Nhat Hanh, let me close with this photo before we begin our exercise of a statue of both men at the Magnolia Grove Monastery in Batesville, Mississippi, which is 62 miles from Memphis, Tennessee, where King died. To me, This was his promise to King, to build a Buddhist monastery that welcomed all people, that helped people learn the practice of mindfulness in their daily lives. It was one bodhisattva gifting to another.